The sun hammered the alkali flats, baking the cracked earth to a blinding white. Heat shimmered above the horizon, blurring the distant, jagged teeth of the mountains. Vultures circled, black specks against the merciless blue. Jed squinted, wiping sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. He'd been tracking stray cattle for 2 days, but the dust devil he'd seen twisting across the plains hadn't been natural. It had been wrong. He found her huddled behind a skeletal rib cage of a long-dead steer, a scrap of faded calico clinging to her thin frame, barely alive. He could smell the sickness on her, the sour stench of dehydration and despair. A child no older than 7. Her eyes were closed, her lips cracked and bleeding. Jed nudged her gently with the toe of his boot. No response. He knelt, his weathered face grim. He knew the odds. Out here in this heat, without water, a man could last a day, maybe 2. A child, less. He reached out, his hand hovering over her face, hesitant. He wasn't used to children, wasn't used to this kind of helplessness. The vultures, sensing weakness, swooped lower, their shadows falling across her face. Jed swore, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He stood, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. The crack of the shot echoed across the desolate landscape. The vultures scattered, startled, but Jed knew they'd be back. They always were. He checked her pulse, faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. He had to get her to water, to shelter. He didn't know who she was, or where she came from. Didn't know why anyone would leave a child to die like this. Didn't matter. All that mattered was getting her out of this hellhole. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, like carrying a handful of feathers. Her head lolled against his shoulder. He started walking, his boots sinking into the soft sand. The sun beat down on his back, relentless. He had a canteen, half full. It wouldn't be enough. He'd have to find something, anything. He noticed something then, a small detail he'd missed in the heat, a crude leather pouch tied around her neck. He gently opened it. Inside, a single, dried sprig of sage and a small, smooth stone, and tucked beneath, a note scribbled in faded ink. He couldn't read it now. He had to keep moving, keep her alive. The vultures were watching, waiting. Jed pushed on, the girl a dead weight in his arms. The sun crawled across the sky, each minute an eternity. He pictured his cabin, a rough-hewn refuge, nestled in a fold of the hills, a day's ride, maybe more. Hope, a dangerous thing, flickered within him. Finally, as dusk painted the sky, in bruised purples and oranges, he saw it, a thin ribbon of green snaking through the parched landscape. A creek. He stumbled towards it, his legs burning, his breath ragged. He lowered her to the ground, gently, and knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands and bringing it to her lips. She didn't respond. He trickled a few drops between her parched lips. She coughed, a weak rattling sound. He kept at it, patiently, until her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of dust, wide and vacant. She stared at him, unblinking, as if he were a mirage. He didn't speak, just kept offering her water. Slowly she began to drink, small sips at first, then with more urgency. He got her to his cabin by nightfall. It was a simple place. 1 room, a dirt floor, a stone fireplace, sparsely furnished with a cot, a table, a couple of chairs. Not much, but it was shelter. He laid her on the cot, covering her with a worn quilt. He stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. He boiled some water, added a handful of dried beans to make a thin broth. He coaxed her to eat a little, spoonful by painstaking spoonful. Over the next few days, Sarah, as he now knew her from the note, slowly regained some strength. She remained mostly silent, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Jed watched her, his gaze steady, unwavering. He noticed the bruises then, faint discolorations on her thin arms and legs, hidden beneath the tattered dress. He saw the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the way she cowered when he raised his voice, even slightly. He understood. He'd seen it before, felt it. The brand of cruelty, seared into a soul. His own past, a dark and bitter landscape he rarely allowed himself to revisit, stirred within him. Images flickered, a drunken father, a mother's silent tears, the sting of a leather belt. He'd run away from it all, years ago, seeking solace in the vast emptiness of the West. He'd found a measure of peace, but the scars remained, etched deep beneath his weathered skin. He saw that same haunted look in Sarah's eyes. He never spoke of it, never asked her questions. He just went about his business, tending to her needs, offering her food, water, and a silent, unwavering presence. He chopped wood, mended fences, hunted for game. He left her alone with her thoughts, allowing her to heal in her own time. He'd leave a smooth stone, like the one in her pouch, on the table each morning. Small acts of kindness. The cabin, usually a place of solitude, now felt different, warmer, less empty. He found himself lingering there longer, watching her, making sure she was safe. He was a solitary man, a creature of habit and routine. He hadn't expected this, didn't know what to do with it, but he knew he couldn't turn away. Not this time, not from her. Days bled into weeks. Sarah's silence, initially born of fear, seemed to settle into something else, a quiet watchfulness. She followed Jed with her eyes, studying his movements, his expressions. He sensed her curiosity, her cautious attempts to understand him. He knew he couldn't remain a silent enigma forever. She needed more than just food and shelter. She needed connection. He started small, pointing at objects, naming them. Horse, he'd say, his voice rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. Tree. She'd watch his lips, her brow furrowed in concentration, then attempt to mimic the sounds, her voice a barely audible whisper. Frustration flickered in her eyes. It was then he remembered old man Hemlock, the deaf prospector who'd wandered through these parts years ago. Hemlock had taught him a few simple signs, a way to speak without speaking. He took Sarah's hand, gently guiding her fingers into the shape of a bird. Bird, he mouthed, then repeated the sign. She watched him intently, her hand trembling slightly. He repeated it again and again, until a flicker of understanding dawned in her eyes. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to teach her the basics. Simple words, simple concepts. Food, water, sleep. He learned quickly, adapting his large, calloused hands to the delicate movements. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp despite the hardships she'd endured. One evening, as the fire crackled merrily, Sarah hesitantly signed a word, Cain. Jed froze, his hand hovering over the pot of stew he was stirring. He knew that name. Cain ran a sprawling ranch south of here, a man known for his cruelty and his ruthlessness. He'd heard whispers, rumors of mistreatment, of unpaid wages, of broken men. He met Sarah's gaze, his eyes questioning. She looked down, her small hands twisting in her lap. Then, slowly, haltingly, she began to sign. She spoke of Cain's ranch, of her mother who had worked as a cook, of the endless chores, the meager meals, the constant fear. She signed of Cain's temper, his heavy hand, the way he looked at her. Jed's jaw tightened. He listened in silence, his heart growing heavier with each signed word. He saw the truth in her eyes, the lingering fear, the deep-seated trauma. He saw the brand of cruelty, not just on her skin, but on her soul. She signed that Cain was looking for her, that he said she owed him. Jed didn't ask what for. He knew. As she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. He didn't need to speak. His eyes told her everything. He wouldn't let Cain touch her, not ever. A fragile hope flickered in her eyes, a tiny spark in the darkness. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise passing between them. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but in the heart of the cabin, a different kind of fire was burning, a fire of resolve, a fire of protection, a fire of something akin to love. The stew simmered, its aroma doing little to ease the knot in Jed's gut. Cain. The name hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy with unspoken menace. Sarah sat quietly by the fire, meticulously cleaning the smooth stone from her pouch, her movements small and precise. He watched her, his gaze protective. He wouldn't let that man near her. He needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee. Things were running low. He hadn't been to the trading post in weeks, avoiding contact, wanting to keep Sarah hidden. But he couldn't put it off any longer. He left at dawn, telling Sarah he'd be back before nightfall. She watched him ride off, her eyes filled with a worry that mirrored his own. He touched his hat brim, a silent reassurance, and urged his horse into a gallop. The trading post was a ramshackle affair, a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled around a dusty square. A few horses were tethered to the hitching post, their riders inside, likely swapping stories and lies over cheap whiskey. Jed dismounted, his senses on high alert. He stepped inside, the smell of tobacco and stale beer hitting him like a wall. A handful of men were gathered around a pot-bellied stove, their voices low and gravelly. He recognized a few faces, ranchers, cowboys, drifters. He kept his head down, moving towards the counter. "Morning, Jed." The storekeeper, a wizened old man named Silas, greeted him. "Haven't seen you in these parts lately." "Just been busy," Jed grunted, scanning the shelves. He gathered what he needed, keeping his ears open. The men by the stove were talking, their voices laced with a mixture of fear and resentment. "Heard Cain's fit to be tied," one of them said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt floor. "That little girl of his run off. Says she stole from him." Another man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Cain says a lot of things. Heard he's been tearing the place apart looking for her. Whipped young Timmy half to death for not seeing nothing." Jed's hand tightened around a sack of flour. His blood ran cold. "Reckon he'll find her," a third man chimed in. "Cain always gets what he wants. And when he does—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Silas cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Jed. "Cain's a powerful man," he said quietly. "Best not to cross him." Jed paid for his supplies, his silence unnerving. He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. He looked back at the men. His eyes narrowed, his face a mask of stoic resolve. "Some things are worth crossing," he said, his voice low but firm. He stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The men watched him go, their faces etched with apprehension. They knew Jed, knew his reputation, knew that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. As he rode back towards his cabin, the vast emptiness of the plains seemed to press in on him. He knew Cain would be coming. It was only a matter of time. And when he did, there would be a reckoning. The sun beat down on Jed's back, each mile a heavy burden. He urged his horse onward, the trading post conversation echoing in his mind. He pictured Sarah alone, vulnerable, and his pace quickened. He found her by the creek, a small figure kneeling in the sand. He dismounted, approaching cautiously. She didn't look up, her focus entirely consumed by the intricate patterns she was tracing with a stick. As he drew closer, he saw it. Map. Crude, but undeniably a map. She looked up, startled, and quickly tried to erase it with her foot, her eyes filled with panic. He knelt beside her, stopping her hand. He pointed to the drawing. "Show me," he mouthed, his voice gentle. Hesitantly, she began to retrace the lines. She pointed to a large, sprawling shape. "Cain," she signed, then tapped the drawing with emphasis. She then indicated a jagged series of lines, a canyon. "Hidden," she signed, then pointed to the canyon and made a grabbing motion, closing her fist. "Gold!" Jed's brow furrowed. He knew Cain was ruthless, but the implication of theft, specifically from the Yavapai, added another layer to his depravity. He'd heard whispers of Cain's dealings with the tribe, unfair trades, broken promises. But gold? That was a different game entirely. Sarah signed again, her movements frantic. She pointed to the canyon, then made a throat-slitting gesture. "Yavapai," she signed, her eyes wide with fear. Jed understood. Cain hadn't just stolen gold. He'd silenced anyone who knew about it. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her. She wasn't just a runaway, a victim of Cain's cruelty. She was a witness, a threat. And now, so was he. The weight of the situation settled upon him, heavier than any sack of flour. He wasn't just protecting her from Cain's anger. He was protecting her from a man who was willing to kill, to protect his secrets. He realized the depth of the danger she was in, and, by extension, the danger he had willingly embraced. He took her hand, his grip firm. He looked at the map again, memorizing the landmarks, the shape of the canyon, the hidden entrance. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just wait for Cain to come to him. He had to go to Cain. He stood, pulling Sarah up with him. He brushed the sand from her dress, his touch surprisingly tender. He looked into her eyes, his gaze unwavering. "We go," he mouthed, then signed the same word. He pointed towards the cabin. "Pack!" She nodded, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a flicker of determination. She understood. They were running. But this time they weren't just running away. They were running towards something. Towards a reckoning. Towards a confrontation with the darkness that had haunted them both. He had a feeling this canyon held more than just stolen gold. It held the key to Sarah's freedom. And maybe, just maybe, to his own redemption. Back at the cabin, Jed moved with a newfound purpose. He gathered supplies, dried meat, ammunition, his rifle. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was clean and loaded. He worked quickly, efficiently, his movements honed by years of surviving in this unforgiving land. Sarah watched him, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. She knew he was planning something dangerous. He avoided her gaze, focusing on the task at hand. He couldn't bear to see the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability that Cain had instilled in her. He finished packing, then turned to Sarah. He took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. He looked into her eyes, his gaze intense. He signed slowly, deliberately. Cain bad. Very bad. He pointed towards the canyon. Dangerous. Then he pointed to her, then to the cabin. You stay. Hidden. Promise? Sarah's eyes widened. She understood. He was going after Cain. Alone. Fear washed over her face, but beneath it, Jed saw a flicker of understanding. She knew he couldn't just run. Not anymore. She shook her head, her eyes pleading. She signed back, her movements rapid and urgent. No, I help. Jed shook his head. He couldn't risk it. Cain would stop at nothing to silence her. He needed to keep her safe, even if it meant going alone. He signed again, his voice firm. Promise, Sarah. Please. Tears welled up in her eyes. She knew he was right. She knew she would only be a liability. But the thought of him facing Cain alone filled her with dread. Finally, reluctantly, she nodded. She squeezed his hands, her gaze unwavering. She signed, her voice a barely audible whisper in the silent cabin. Promise, but be careful. Jed nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He knew it was a fragile promise, born of fear and desperation. But it was enough. It had to be. He released her hands and turned towards the door. He paused, looking back at her one last time. He knew this could be the last time he ever saw her. He touched his hat brim, a silent farewell. He stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He mounted his horse and turned towards the canyon, his heart filled with a mixture of dread and resolve. He was riding into the unknown, into the heart of Cain's darkness. He only hoped he could make it back alive. He only hoped he could keep his promise to protect Sarah. He knew that the pact of silence they shared, forged in shared suffering, was now a pact of survival. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple as Jed approached Cain's ranch. It wasn't a ranch in the traditional sense, not with sprawling fields and contented livestock. It was more like a fortress carved out of the desert, a collection of dilapidated buildings huddled together, surrounded by a high fence of barbed wire. The air hung thick with dust and the stench of fear. He dismounted a good distance away, tying his horse to a scraggly mesquite tree. He moved on foot, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his senses on high alert. The place felt wrong, devoid of life, save for the buzz of flies and the occasional mournful howl of a distant coyote. He reached the gate, a crude affair made of rusted iron. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, the sound echoing in the still evening air. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the parched earth. The main house was a 2-story structure, its windows dark and lifeless. A single lantern flickered in the doorway, casting long, distorted shadows. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his revolver. He kicked the door open, the sound reverberating through the silent house. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was sparsely furnished, a table and a few chairs, a fireplace filled with cold ashes. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. Kane sat at the table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Jed. A sneer twisted his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with alcohol. "Look what the cat dragged in. Jedediah. Thought you'd be holed up in your little shack, playing house with that thing you took in." Jed didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Sarah's name is Sarah." Kane chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Sarah, is it? She's got a real knack for disappearing, that one. Like that gold she stole." Jed's hand tightened on his rifle. "She didn't steal anything, didn't she?" Kane raised an eyebrow, his eyes glinting with malice. "Then what brings you here, Jed? Come to pay your respects? Or maybe you're looking for something that ain't yours to find?" Jed took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "I'm here for Sarah, and for the Yavapai gold you stole. The gold you killed for." Kane's face hardened. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the bottle. "You got no proof of that. Just a crazy girl's lies." "I don't need proof," Jed replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I know the truth." He let the silence hang heavy up between them, a tangible thing, thick with unspoken threats. "Where is she, Kane?" Kane's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol tucked in his waistband. "You accusing me, Jedediah? That's a dangerous game you're playing." Jed didn't back down. "Just tell me where Sarah is." Kane hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He knew Jed wasn't easily intimidated. He needed time to think, to assess the situation. "She's safe. I sent her away. Somewhere she can't cause any more trouble." Jed didn't believe him. He could see the lie etched on Kane's face. He lowered his rifle slightly, feigning a moment of consideration. "I'll take your word for it, but I want to see her. I want to know she's safe." Kane scoffed. "You think you can just waltz in here and make demands? You got another thing coming." He stood up, his bulk filling the small room. "Get out, Jedediah, before you regret it." Jed held his ground. Not without Sarah. He shifted his gaze past Kane, towards the shadows, at the edge of the room. He could hear the faint rustling of movement, the telltale sign of others lurking nearby. "Looks like you've got company, Kane. Don't want them getting hurt in our little disagreement." Kane's eyes darted around the room, betraying his nervousness. He was surrounded by men loyal to him, men who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. But he knew Jed wasn't afraid to die, and he knew that a gunfight in the house would draw unwanted attention. "All right, Jedediah," Kane said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "You want to see Sarah? Fine, I'll show you." He gestured towards the door with a curt nod. "But don't try anything stupid." Jed followed Kane out of the house, his rifle still held loosely in his hand. The ranch yard was deserted, the only sound the creaking of the wind in the dilapidated buildings. Kane led him towards a small, ramshackle shed at the edge of the property. As they walked, Jed subtly scanned the faces of the men he saw. They were rough-looking, hardened by the harsh life of the West, but he noticed something else, a certain unease in their eyes, a hesitation in their movements. When Kane passed, it was as if they were afraid of him. Reaching the shed, Kane unlocked the door with a rusty key. He swung it open, revealing a dark, cramped space. "She's in here. Go on, take a look." Jed hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He could barely make out the shape of a figure huddled in the corner. "Sarah?" he called out softly. A weak voice answered him. "Jed?" He moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He saw a small, frail figure huddled on the floor, her face pale and bruised. It was Sarah. But this wasn't the determined, resourceful woman he'd come to know. This was a broken, frightened girl. Cain stood in the doorway, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Satisfied, Jedediah? Now get out!" Jed ignored Cain. He knelt beside Sarah, his heart aching at her condition. "Sarah, are you all right?" He signed, gently, his fingers brushing her cheek. She flinched at his touch. Then recognition dawned in her eyes. "Jed," she signed back weakly, her movements slow and labored. He hit me." Rage surged through Jed, a cold, controlled fury. He wanted to kill Cain, to make him suffer for what he had done, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed to get Sarah out of here first. He carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her weight. "We're leaving, Sarah. Now!" He turned to Cain, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're a dead man, Cain. But I'll deal with you later." Cain just laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. "You think you can just walk out of here, Jedediah? You're wrong. This is my land, and I make the rules." Jed ignored him. He led Sarah out of the shed, ignoring the stares of Cain's men. They seemed hesitant, unsure of what to do. He could feel their eyes on him, their fear and resentment. He helped Sarah onto his horse, then mounted behind her. He turned the horse towards the open gate, his rifle held ready. "Stop them!" Cain yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "Don't let them get away!" The men stirred, their hands reaching for their guns. But they hesitated, their eyes darting between Jed and Cain. They knew Jed was dangerous, and they knew that Cain was losing control. Jed spurred his horse forward, galloping towards the gate. A few shots rang out, but they went wide. He reached the gate and burst through, leaving Cain and his men behind. He didn't stop until he was far away from the ranch, hidden amongst the rocky hills. He dismounted, helping Sarah to the ground. He found a sheltered spot beneath a towering rock formation and gently laid her down. He examined her injuries, his hands gentle and careful. She had a nasty bruise on her cheek and a cut on her lip. He cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen and bandaged them with a piece of cloth. "Thank you, Jed," she signed, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved me." He nodded, unable to speak. He was still consumed by rage, by the need for revenge. But he knew he had to control himself. He had to focus on Sarah, on her safety. He remembered the map she had given him, the map that led to the Yavapai gold. He looked at Sarah, her face pale and drawn. He knew he had to find that gold, not for himself, but for her. It was the only way to ensure her safety, to give her a chance at a new life. He signed to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Rest, Sarah. I'll be back." He pointed towards the canyon on the map. "I have to find something." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. She knew he was going after Cain, alone, but she also knew she couldn't stop him. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Be careful, Jed." Jed vanished into the mouth of the canyon, leaving Sarah nestled in the meager shade. The air grew thick and still, the only sound the whisper of wind through the scrub brush. He moved with a practiced ease, his senses honed by years of survival in this unforgiving land. The map, etched onto a piece of tanned hide, felt heavy against his chest. It wasn't the gold he craved, but the freedom it represented for Sarah, a future far removed from Cain's cruelty. The canyon walls rose sharply, choking out the fading sunlight. The narrow passage twisted and turned, each bend a potential hiding place. Jed knew Cain wouldn't let him walk away, not with the knowledge he possessed, not with Sarah as a loose end. He rounded a bend and the world exploded. A volley of gunfire ripped through the air, the sharp reports echoing off the canyon walls. Bullets whizzed past his head, kicking up dust and rock fragments. He dove for cover, behind a boulder, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling his nostrils. Kane's voice, amplified by the canyon, boomed, "Figured you'd come sniffing around, Jedediah. This is where it ends." Jed didn't reply. He knew talking was a waste of breath. He peered around the edge of the boulder, assessing the situation. He counted at least 5 men spread out along the canyon rim, providing covering fire. Kane himself was nowhere in sight, likely positioned further back, orchestrating the ambush. He returned fire, squeezing off carefully aimed shots. He saw one of Kane's men stumble and fall, clutching his arm. But the others kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. He was pinned down, outgunned, and outnumbered. He needed to move, to find a way out of this death trap. He spotted a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. He took a deep breath, steeled his nerves, and made a break for it. He sprinted towards the crevice, bullets peppering the rock around him. He felt a searing pain in his side, a bullet tearing through his flesh. He gritted his teeth and kept running, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He reached the crevice and squeezed inside, the rough rock scraping against his skin. He wormed his way through the narrow passage, the darkness closing in around him. He emerged on the other side, into a small, hidden alcove. He was safe, for now. He leaned against the cool rock, catching his breath. He pressed his hand against the wound in his side, the blood seeping through his fingers. He needed to tend to it, but first he had to get out of the canyon. He knew Kane wouldn't give up. He would hunt him down relentlessly until he was dead. Jed had underestimated Kane's desperation. He had to get back to Sarah, protect her. He had to find a way to end this, once and for all. The goal didn't matter anymore. Only Sarah's safety, and Kane's reckoning did. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt and tied it tightly around the wound, staunching the flow of blood. The pain was intense, but he ignored it. He had to focus. He scanned the alcove, looking for a way out. He spotted a narrow ledge, leading upwards. It looked treacherous, but it was better than nothing. He started to climb, his body aching with every move. The ledge was slick with the moisture, and the rock was loose and crumbly. He clung to the wall, his fingers searching for purchase. He reached the top, pulling himself over the edge. He was on a high plateau, overlooking the canyon. He could see Kane and his men searching below, their figures small and insignificant against the vast landscape. He knew they would eventually find him. He had to draw them away from Sarah. He started running, heading towards the open plains. He knew Kane would follow. He was leaving a clear trail, sacrificing himself to protect her. He reached a small settlement, a cluster of ramshackle buildings huddled together against the wind. He spotted a young boy no older than 10 playing in the dirt. He recognized the boy. He was the son of a local rancher, a good kid. He approached the boy, kneeling down to his level. He pulled out a silver dollar and pressed it into the boy's hand. "I need you to do something for me," he signed, his voice hoarse. "Ride to the sheriff in Willow Creek. Tell him Kane is holed up in the canyon with a woman. Tell him Jedediah sent you." The boy looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. He knew who Jedediah was. He had heard the stories, the whispers of a silent gunslinger. He nodded, his grip tightening on the silver dollar. "Go now," Jedediah signed, "and be careful." The boy ran off, disappearing into the maze of buildings. Jed watched him go, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He knew the sheriff was a good man, a fair man. He would come. But it might be too late. He mounted his horse, his body screaming in protest. He turned the horse towards the open plains, towards Cain. He knew this confrontation might be his last. He could feel it in his bones. But he refused to let Sarah suffer any longer. He would face Cain, alone if necessary, and end this once and for all. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. It was a fitting backdrop for the coming storm. He rode for what felt like hours, the relentless sun beating down on his back, the pain in his side, a constant reminder of the danger he faced. He knew Cain was gaining on him. He could feel it. He crested a small rise and saw them in the distance, a cloud of dust rising from the ground as they raced towards him. He stopped his horse, dismounted, and waited. He knew running was futile. He had to face them. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. The sun was almost touching the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the plains. Cain and his men rode up, surrounding him. Cain dismounted, his face contorted with rage. "This is it, Jedediah," Cain sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "The end of the line." Jed didn't reply. He simply stared at Cain, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You think you're a hero, Jedediah?" Cain continued. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine? You're wrong. Everything here belongs to me, and I'll kill anyone who tries to take it from me." Cain drew his gun, a Colt Peacemaker, its metal gleaming in the fading light. Jed mirrored the movement, raising his rifle. "I'm not afraid of you, Cain," Jed signed, his voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing but a bully, and bullies always get what's coming to them." Cain laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that, Jedediah. We'll see about that." Cain fired. The shot rang out, shattering the silence. Jed ducked, the bullet whizzing past his head. He returned fire, squeezing the trigger. His shot found its mark, hitting Cain in the shoulder. Cain cried out in pain, dropping his gun. Jed advanced, his rifle trained on Cain's chest. "It's over, Cain," Jed signed. "Give up." Cain, fueled by fury, lunged forward, tackling Jed to the ground. They wrestled in the dirt, a desperate, brutal struggle. Cain was bigger, stronger, but Jed was fueled by righteous anger. Cain landed a blow to Jed's face, stunning him. Jed tasted blood, but he refused to give up. He rolled over, pinning Cain beneath him. He grabbed Cain's throat, squeezing tightly. Cain struggled, his face turning red, then purple. Jed didn't release his grip. He thought of Sarah, of the pain and suffering Cain had inflicted upon her. He thought of all the other innocent people Cain had wronged. He squeezed harder. Cain's struggles weakened. His eyes rolled back in his head. Jed knew he was close to killing him, but he stopped. He couldn't become like Cain. He couldn't let the darkness consume him. He released his grip, gasping for breath. Cain lay still, unconscious. Jed stood up, his body aching, his face bruised and bloody. He looked at Cain's men, who were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "Take him," Jed signed, pointing to Cain. "Get him out of here, and don't ever come back." The men hesitated, then slowly approached Cain. They lifted him up, carrying him away. Jed watched them go, his heart heavy. He had won, but at what cost? The victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the plains into darkness. Jed knew he had to get back to Sarah. He had to make sure she was safe. He turned his horse and rode off, The echo of gunfire still rang in Jed's ears as he urged his horse back towards the hidden spring where he'd left Sarah. The night air held a chill, a stark contrast to the burning ache in his side. He pushed onward, the image of her face, etched with worry and resilience, fueling his weary limbs. He found her as he'd left her, huddled near the dying embers of the small fire, triplets nestled close. Her eyes, though shadowed by fear, lit with a raw, palpable relief when she saw him. No words passed between them, just a shared understanding forged in hardship. He knew she could see the fight etched on his face, the weariness that settled deep in his bones. Before dawn painted the sky, the distant thud of horses broke the silence. Jed tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But the figures that emerged from the darkness weren't Kane's. Sheriff Buckley, a man whose weathered face mirrored the harshness of the land he governed, rode at the head of a small posse. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over Jed, then settling on Sarah and the children. "Heard tell there was trouble brewing out here," Buckley said, his voice gravelly. "Young fella from the settlement rode in, talking about Kane holding a woman hostage." Jed nodded, his silence speaking volumes. He pointed in the direction of the plains where he'd left Kane and his men. Buckley followed his gesture, his eyes narrowing. "They won't be far," Jed sighed. "Kane's wounded." Buckley's gaze shifted to Sarah, a flicker of compassion softening his features. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "you and your young'uns are safe now. We'll take care of this." The arrest was swift and decisive. Kane, weakened by his wound, offered little resistance. His men, demoralized by their leader's defeat, surrendered without a fight. The sheriff's posse rounded them up, their faces grim. As Kane was hauled onto a horse, his eyes met Jed's. Hatred burned in their depths, a silent promise of vengeance. Jed simply stared back, unflinching. He knew this wouldn't be the end, but for now, it was enough. With Kane and his men gone, a palpable shift settled over the small clearing. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze locking with Jed's. A hesitant smile touched her lips, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen on her face in what felt like a lifetime. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jed simply nodded, his gaze softening. He had done what he felt was right. He had offered a small measure of justice in a land often devoid of it. He looked at Sarah and her children, their faces illuminated by the rising sun. They had a chance now, a chance at a life free from fear. And that, he realized, was all that truly mattered. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet purpose. The sheriff and his men escorted Sarah and her triplets to a small, abandoned homestead a few miles outside Willow Creek. It wasn't much, a single-room cabin with a leaky roof and a patch of overgrown land, but it was theirs. A fresh start. Jed visited every day, his presence a silent promise of protection. He helped Sarah repair the cabin, patching the roof, reinforcing the walls, and clearing the land for planting. He didn't speak, but his actions spoke volumes. He was there for her, a steadfast presence in a world that had offered her little kindness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah sat on the porch, watching Jed work. He was mending a broken fence, his movements deliberate and efficient. She watched his strong hands calloused and scarred, yet capable of such gentleness. She picked up a piece of charcoal and a scrap of wood. Hesitantly, she began to draw, her hand tracing the lines of his silhouette against the fiery sky. It wasn't perfect, but it captured something of his essence, his strength, his quiet dignity, his unwavering resolve. When she finished, she held it out to him. Jed stopped working and turned to her, his eyes questioning. She offered him the drawing, her face flushed with nervousness. He took it, his gaze lingering on the crude image. A flicker of something akin to surprise or perhaps even gratitude crossed his face. He looked at her, then back at the drawing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn knife. He used it to carve a small notch in the wooden frame of the cabin, right above the doorway. He carefully placed the drawing into the notch, securing it with a small twig. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a sign that he valued her, that he appreciated her, that he saw her. In the days that followed, Sarah began to learn. Jed, with his surprising patience, taught her to read and write. He would write words in the dirt with a stick, and she would carefully copy them, her brow furrowed in concentration. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to unlock the secrets of language. With each new word she learned, her world expanded. She began to read the few books that were left in the cabin, her voice a hesitant whisper as she sounded out the words. She wrote letters to her deceased husband, pouring out her heart onto the page, sharing her hopes and fears. The landscape, too, began to soften. The harsh winter gave way to a gentle spring. Wildflowers bloomed in vibrant colors, painting the hillsides with life. Sarah planted a small garden, her hands working the soil with newfound purpose. The triplets, now thriving, chased butterflies through the tall grass, their laughter echoing through the valley. Sarah was healing, slowly but surely. The pain of her past still lingered, but it was no longer all-consuming. She was finding her voice, not through spoken words, but through the written word, through her art, through her actions. She was building a new life, brick by brick, with the help of a silent gunslinger who had shown her that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. The cabin became a sanctuary, a testament to resilience carved out of the unforgiving West. Days bled into weeks, then months. Jed remained, a silent guardian, his presence a constant reassurance. He taught Sarah more than just reading and writing. He showed her how to mend fences, track game, and read the language of the land. He never forced conversation, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended words. Sarah, in turn, taught him a different kind of language, the language of patience, of forgiveness, of quiet joy. She saw past the weathered exterior, the haunted eyes, to the man beneath, a man capable of profound kindness. She learned his rhythms, the subtle shifts in his posture that betrayed his emotions. She knew when he needed silence and when he needed her presence, a quiet hand on his arm, a warm meal on the table. They existed in a space of unspoken understanding, their connection forged in the crucible of hardship. The triplets, oblivious to the darkness that had once threatened their lives, thrived under their care. They were a constant source of laughter in chaos, their innocent energy filling the small cabin with life. One evening, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in a riot of colors, Jed and Sarah stood on the porch, watching the horizon. The triplets were asleep inside, their small bodies curled together in peaceful slumber. A gentle breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Sarah leaned against the wooden railing, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying with it echoes of the past. She could almost hear the voices of her deceased husband, the laughter of her lost friends, the cries of the children who had perished in the harsh winter. But tonight the echoes were fainter, less painful. They were fading into the vastness of the desert, replaced by a new melody, a song of hope and healing. She felt Jed's presence beside her, a solid, unwavering anchor in a world of uncertainty. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, no words were necessary. They understood each other perfectly. They had both known loss, both endured hardship, both faced the darkness. But they had also found each other, a beacon of light in the wilderness. As the last rays of sun disappeared below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, they stood hand in hand, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of twilight. The west remained wild and unforgiving, but in their small corner of the world, a new story was being written, a story of compassion, understanding, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying the echoes of Sarah's past, now fading into the vastness of the desert, leaving behind a quiet promise of a future built on hope.